It all began on the rooftop of the Langford and Beaumont headquarters in Canary Wharf, where one of London's most powerful architecture firms was hosting its annual client gala. Every eye in the room fixed on the same impossible scene. The woman who ran the company, the one no one had ever seen flinch, was standing in my arms while I still wore my work uniform. No music had been requested, no introduction had been made, and yet there she was, letting me lead. Then she leaned into my shoulder and, in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, whispered, "Please don't leave me." No one in that room understood what they were witnessing, but something had already broken open. The building never fully slept. Even after the last architect had shut down their workstation and the lifts had stopped cycling between floors, Langford and Beaumont kept humming, the ventilation systems, the servers, cooling the low electrical pulse that ran through 42 stories of steel and glass. I knew that pulse better than most. I had been maintaining it for years. I moved through the building the way people move through places they have stopped seeing. Corridors that would once have impressed me, the exposed concrete, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the London skyline, had long since become nothing more than the route between one broken thing and the next. I carried my toolkit the way other men carry briefcases, with the same ritual, the same absence of thought. I had studied architecture once, years ago, at a university in the north. I had been good at it, genuinely good. The kind of student whose professors kept my drafts to show future classes. But in my second year, the money ran out. Not gradually, all at once. My father's business collapsed and I came home because there was no other option. I never went back. That door closed with the soft click of something locking from the other side. What I kept was a sketchbook, not for nostalgia. I told myself it was simply a habit, something I did on breaks when the building was quiet. But the drawings inside were unlike anything Langford and Beaumont produced. No luxury condominiums, no corporate facades. I drew community centers, public libraries, covered markets for neighborhoods that did not have them. Buildings designed for people who would never attend a rooftop gala. I kept the sketchbook in my locker and never mentioned it to anyone. Beatrice Langford had been chief executive of Langford and Beaumont for years, and in all that time no one had seen her rattled. That was the first thing new hires learned about her. Not her track record, not the accounts she had brought in, but the fact that she did not visibly break. She moved through boardrooms and client meetings with the kind of precision that left people feeling slightly outpaced. Her decisions were clean, her language was direct. She kept a personal distance from everyone in the building. Not out of arrogance, people said, but because warmth costs time, and time was the one thing she never wasted. She had earned her position the hard way, fighting for it through a firm that had never fully expected a woman of her age to last in that chair. And she had lasted. She had more than lasted. But the version of herself that had survived all of that left little room for anything she could not control. I had never spoken to her directly. I had seen her the way maintenance staff see executives, in passing, from a distance, on the other side of a closing lift door. She was a presence in the building the way weather is a presence. You do not interact with it. You work around it. I was on the 38th floor one Tuesday night, running a diagnostic on a faulty circuit in the executive wing's electrical panel when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the ventilation. Then, I went still and listened again. It was coming from behind the wall, from the large corner office on the other side, the one with the frosted glass and the nameplate I already knew by heart. The ceiling access panel was 2 feet from where I crouched. I had not intended to look, but the sound was unmistakable now. Someone was crying. Not the soft, managed kind people allow themselves when they think they are composed. This was the kind that comes out when a person has been holding something too long. I shifted on instinct and looked through the narrow gap in the ceiling grid. The office below was dark except for the ambient light bleeding in from the city outside. Beatrice Langford was sitting on the floor behind her desk, her jacket folded over the arm of her chair, her back against the cabinet. Her face was turned up toward the ceiling, her eyes were closed, and she looked like someone who had just finished running a very long distance and had nothing left. I did not make a sound. I did not move. After a minute, I carefully repositioned myself, finished my work on the panel, and climbed down without turning on any additional lights. I told no one what I had seen. I filed my report for the night, logged my hours, and drove home in the kind of silence that sits differently than the usual kind. I kept thinking about her face, not with pity exactly, but with recognition. I had seen that expression before. I had worn it myself in the months after I came home and understood that the life I had been building was gone. It was the face of someone who had run out of ways to pretend that everything was fine. The annual client gala was held on the rooftop of the Langford and Beaumont building every spring, and it was exactly what I expected it to be: catered, curated, and completely insulated from the rest of the world. I was not a guest. I was there because someone had flagged a loose connection in the temporary lighting rig that morning, and my supervisor had asked me to stay available through the evening in case anything failed. I stood near the service entrance in my work clothes, watching a room full of people who wore their expensive suits the way I wore my toolkit, automatically without thinking. I spotted Beatrice Langford early. She was working the room the way she always did, controlled and purposeful, moving from one conversation cluster to the next without breaking pace. From across the rooftop, she looked exactly like the woman everyone in the building described: unreachable, entirely composed. Then I saw the moment she stopped. It was near the bar on the far side of the terrace. A man had stepped into her path, tall, well-dressed, with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed confidence for so long that it had replaced the real thing. I did not know the man's name then. I would learn it later: Sebastian Fairfax. But in that moment, what I saw was simple. Beatrice's entire body changed. Not dramatically. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. But the color left her face, and something behind her eyes shut down the way a window goes dark from the inside. She excused herself from the conversation within 30 seconds and moved toward the far edge of the terrace, past the reach of the ambient lighting, where the rooftop gave way to shadow and the noise of the party became something you could almost ignore. I watched her go. I waited. A full 2 minutes passed, and she did not come back. I set down the equipment case I was holding and walked in the direction she had gone. She was standing at the railing when I found her, both hands gripping the steel, looking out over the city. Not at it, through it. Her jaw was tight, her breathing was deliberate. She was doing the work of staying in control, and it was costing her. She heard me approach and turned, ready, probably, to tell whoever it was that she needed a moment. When she saw it was me, the maintenance worker, the man in the worn navy jacket who fixed things in walls, she never thought about. Something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not irritation, just a kind of blank surprise that she did not have the energy to cover. I did not explain myself. I did not make a speech. I simply reached out my right hand, palm up, steady and unhurried, and looked at her directly. "One dance," I said. "Right here. Nobody's paying attention to this corner." Beatrice looked at my hand for a long moment. Behind her, the party continued. Somewhere across the terrace, Sebastian Fairfax was still working the room, still talking, still doing whatever it was he had come there to do. And she was out here alone, trying to remember how to breathe. She took my hand. She was not a dancer. That was clear from the first few seconds. Her body held tension the way structural steel holds load, distributed evenly, invisibly, but constant. She moved with me because I moved slowly enough to make it easy. One hand in mine, the other resting at my shoulder like she was still deciding whether this was a mistake. There was no music in our corner of the terrace. The sound from the party carried over in waves, conversation, laughter, the clink of glassware, but it felt distant in the way that noise always feels distant when your attention is somewhere else entirely. I kept my hand steady at her back. I did not try to fill the space between us with words. I had learned a long time ago, in the way people learn things without being taught, that silence offered to someone in distress is a different thing than silence imposed on them. I simply held the frame and let her find her footing. A full minute passed before I felt it, the slow release of something through her shoulders, not a collapse, just the beginning of her stopping to fight the air around her. Beatrice was aware of how this looked. She was always aware of how things looked. It was one of the conditions of the role she occupied. The knowledge that every choice she made in a room full of people was a piece of information being filed and interpreted by everyone present. A chief executive who left the party was a chief executive who needed a break. A chief executive who showed strain was a chief executive the board would quietly begin to reassess. She had managed that particular pressure for years by never giving anyone a readable moment. And now she was standing in a corner of her own rooftop event in the arms of a man who fixed circuit panels for a living, moving slowly to music that was not playing. If she had been told that morning that this would be her evening, she would have called it impossible. She did not pull away. There was something in the simplicity of what I had offered, just the hand extended, no explanation required, that had cut straight through the calculation she usually applied to every decision. She had not thought about it. She had just taken my hand because in that specific moment, with Sebastian Fairfax 40 feet away and the entire board of Langford and Beaumont somewhere in that crowd, it was the only thing being offered that did not want something from her. "You work nights," she said. It was not a question. She had seen my badge when I stepped close, Rowan Whitaker, maintenance level B. "Most of them," I said. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," I said. "Does that change anything?" Beatrice considered that for a moment, looking past my shoulder at the lights of the city beyond the railing. "I don't know yet," she said, and something in her voice had shifted, still guarded but no longer armored. We had been moving in silence for another minute when it happened. It was not dramatic. There was no single thing that caused it. The tension had simply been draining out of her degree by degree, and at some point the last of it went, and she leaned her head slowly against my shoulder the way a person leans against a wall when they have finally stopped pretending they do not need the support. I did not move. I kept my hand steady at her back and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would improve on the quiet. Then, in a voice low enough that it barely carried past the space between us, she said, "Please don't leave me." She did not mean the dance. I understood that immediately. She meant the corner, the shadow at the edge of the terrace, the only place on that rooftop where no one was asking anything of her. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. She did not lift her head, and for another 30 seconds the party behind us continued as if nothing unusual was happening 40 feet away, which was, in its own way, a small mercy. It started the way attention always starts in a room full of people who read status as a second language, with a look held one beat too long, a conversation that tapered off mid-sentence, a hand touching someone else's arm to redirect their gaze. Within 90 seconds, a loose cluster of guests near the bar had turned in our direction. The chief executive of Langford and Beaumont, in the corner of her own event, in close conversation with a man in a maintenance uniform. No introduction had been made, no context provided. I felt the shift in the room before I could see it, the particular kind of quiet that spreads through a crowd when something unusual is happening. I kept my posture steady. I did not look around. Beatrice had noticed it too. She lifted her head from my shoulder and her hand tensed slightly in mine, not pulling away, but registering. "They're watching," she said. "They were always going to," I replied. "You left the room. That's all they needed." She did not argue with that because it was true. She breathed out slowly, and I felt her make a decision to stay in this corner, in this dance, for another minute at least. That decision cost her something. I could tell by the line of her jaw. Sebastian Fairfax had never been the kind of man who waited for a good moment. He created them. He had built his career on the ability to read a room and identify the precise point at which a competitor was most exposed. And he had always moved toward that point without hesitation. It was the thing that had made him dangerous when he and Beatrice were together. It was the thing that made him more dangerous now that they were not. He crossed the terrace with a drink in his hand and the particular ease of a man who had already decided how this would end. The crowd near the bar parted slightly as he passed, not out of deference, but out of the instinctive recognition that something was about to happen. He stopped at a distance that was just close enough to be addressed publicly, just far enough to give himself the option of framing it as casual. "Beatrice." His voice was warm in the way cold things can be warm at the surface, briefly. I didn't realize the entertainment had started. Several people nearby looked up. Beatrice's hand released from mine. She turned to face Sebastian directly, and her expression had gone flat and precise. The same face she wore in board presentations when she was about to dismantle an argument. Sebastian did not give her the opening. He turned his attention to the small crowd that had gathered and spread his hands in a way that suggested he was sharing an observation everyone already agreed with. He said that it was telling, was it not, that on the night Langford and Beaumont was supposed to be courting its most significant clients of the year, the woman running the company had stepped away from the room. That the pressure of the role had a tendency to surface in moments like this. That he was not saying anything the board had not already been quietly discussing. His voice was controlled and unhurried. He was not shouting. He did not need to. "She's not losing control," I said. The words came out before I had decided to say them. I was not loud about it. I did not position myself between them in any physical way. I simply said it clearly into the space Sebastian had left open. Several guests looked at me, the maintenance worker, the man in the worn jacket, and the absurdity of my presence in that moment was visible on their faces. Sebastian looked at me with the particular expression of a man who was mildly amused to find an obstacle in an unexpected place. "I'm sorry," he said, tilting his head. "And you are?" "Nobody you'd recognize," I said, "which is probably why you're not worried about me." Beatrice stepped forward. Whatever she had been holding together for the past several minutes, the careful breathing, the managed distance, the decision to stay in that corner one moment longer, it ended there. Not because Sebastian had won something, but because he had said the word bored out loud in front of clients with the satisfied tone of a man who had already made arrangements, and something in her had gone very still and very clear. She addressed the room, not Sebastian. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way she always spoke in a meeting, directly, with the expectation that she would be heard. She said that Sebastian Fairfax had been a partner at a competitor firm for the past 3 years, and that, in the 18 months before that, he had been a silent backer of 2 projects that Langford and Beaumont had eventually been forced to renegotiate due to compromised source data. She said she knew that because she had been the one to discover it. She also said that she and Sebastian had been in a relationship during part of that period and that she had not disclosed the professional conflict immediately because she had not understood at the time how deliberate it was. She had believed for longer than she should have that what was happening was complicated rather than calculated. The terrace had gone fully quiet now, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a speaker to reach their point. The kind of quiet that fills a room when people are processing something they did not expect to hear. Beatrice kept her eyes on the crowd, on the clients, on the 2 board members she could see standing near the far edge of the terrace. She did not look at Sebastian. She said that she understood if this raised questions about her judgment. She said it directly, without hedging, because she had spent years hedging it internally and it had not made the question go away. And then she said something she had not rehearsed because she had not known until that moment that she was going to say it. "If the board believes that transparency about my own history disqualifies me from this role, then I will accept whatever decision they make. Put it to a vote. I'll be in my office Monday morning regardless of the outcome." She stopped talking. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Sebastian stood with his drink still in his hand, and for the first time since he had crossed the terrace, he had nothing to say. Not because he lacked material, but because the frame he had been working inside had just been dismantled from within. He had expected her to deflect. He had prepared for her to deny. He had not prepared for her to agree that there was something worth examining and then offer to let it be examined in public. He looked for just a moment like a man who had arrived at a locked door and found it already open with no idea what to do about the room inside. The board members near the far railing were not speaking to each other. The clients near the bar had not moved. The entire rooftop event, the catering, the lighting rig I had been called in to monitor, the careful architecture of the evening that Langford and Beaumont's PR team had spent weeks planning had come to a complete stop. Beatrice stood at the center of it, and she did not look away, and she did not reach for anything to hold on to. I watched her from 2 feet away, and what I saw was not a woman losing control. It was a woman who had finally decided that control was not the point. Sebastian set his glass down on the nearest surface and walked toward the lift. He did not say anything. There was nothing left to say that would not cost him more than leaving. The doors closed behind him and the rooftop stayed quiet. Nobody moved. That was the first thing I registered after the lift doors closed behind Sebastian Fairfax. The rooftop, 40-some guests, catering staff, board members, clients who together represented the better part of Langford and Beaumont's annual revenue, had become a room in which no one was willing to be the first person to speak. Beatrice was still standing where she had been standing. She had not adjusted her posture. She had not reached for a drink or turned away to signal that the moment was over. She simply stood there in the middle of everything she had just said and let the silence do what silence does. I stayed where I was, 2 feet behind her, close enough that she would know I had not moved, far enough that the space around her was her own. I watched the board members near the far railing. One of them, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to making decisions that other people live with, was looking at Beatrice with an expression that was difficult to read, not hostile, not reassured, calculating in the careful way that serious people calculate. The other board member beside him, a woman I did not recognize, had her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor. She was thinking hard about something. Whatever it was, she had not reached a conclusion yet. The client who spoke first was not who I would have predicted. He was a man named Gerald Marsh, who ran a regional development group out of Manchester and had been working with Langford and Beaumont for nearly a decade. He was not the largest account in the room. He was not the most visibly prominent, but he stepped forward from where he had been standing near the bar, set his glass down on a nearby table, and addressed Beatrice directly. Gerald said that in 9 years of doing business with this firm, he had watched 3 different leadership regimes come through. He said the previous 2 had been more polished about their failures, which had ultimately cost him more money than he had ever recovered. He said he was not particularly interested in Polish. He was interested in whether the person across the table from him was telling him the truth, and that tonight, whatever else it had been, had settled that question for him. He said he would be renewing his contract. Gerald Marsh sat back down without looking at anyone else, and the silence that followed his statement was a different kind than the one that had preceded it. It had somewhere to go now. A second client, a woman named Dana Whitfield, who headed a commercial real estate group out of Birmingham, spoke next. She said she appreciated directness and that she had spent 15 years in an industry where it was rare. She would be in touch with the contracts team on Monday. Then a third, then another. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen unanimously. 2 guests near the lift said nothing and left within the next 20 minutes, and I noted that neither board member made any public statement that evening. But the room had tipped, the particular gravity of the moment had shifted, and what had looked 60 seconds ago like the controlled demolition of a career had become something else. What exactly, nobody could have said yet, but something else. Beatrice did not cry. She did not visibly exhale or reach for anyone. She thanked each client individually by name, and her voice was steady throughout. Not the performed steadiness she had been holding earlier in the evening, but the real kind. The kind that comes after a person has already gone through the worst of something and is now simply on the other side of it. I watched her work the room again, slowly, and this time the distance she kept was different, not armor, just space. I stayed near the service entrance until the event formally ended, which it did in the quiet, unannounced way of evenings that have run past their natural conclusion. The catering team broke down the setup. The lighting rig, which had held without incident all night, was powered down. Guests filtered to the lifts in clusters of 2 and 3. By the time the terrace was empty, the London skyline was doing what it always did. Indifferent, illuminated, completely unconcerned with what had just happened 42 stories above the street. I was coiling a section of cable near the far wall when I heard footsteps behind me. Beatrice stopped a few feet away. She had her jacket back on. Her composure was fully returned, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there at the start of the evening, or rather something that had always been there but was no longer hidden. She looked like a person, not a position. "You didn't have to say anything," she said. When he asked who you were, "I know," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Why did you?" I thought about that. I thought about the ceiling panel on the 38th floor, and the woman sitting on the floor of a dark office, and the particular quality of silence that follows a sound you were not meant to hear. I thought about my sketchbook in the locker downstairs, and the buildings in it that no one had ever commissioned, and the years I had spent in this building fixing other people's work while my own sat untouched. Because someone needed to, I said, and I was the only one standing close enough. Beatrice studied me the way she studied things when she was deciding what they actually were. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when an answer is simpler and more honest than they expected. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Good night," I said. She walked to the lift. I went back to the cable. The terrace lights clicked off in sequence behind her, and I finished my work in the dark, which was, after all, how I usually did it. The board met the following Monday. I was not in the room, and no one told me what was said, but I learned the outcome the way everyone in the building learned it. Through the particular quality of the Wednesday morning when Beatrice walked through the lobby at her usual time, and nobody looked surprised to see her. She was still chief executive. Whatever the board had concluded in that meeting, it had not been what Sebastian Fairfax had come to the gala to arrange. 2 months after the gala, Langford and Beaumont announced an internal development initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program for employees without completed degrees who demonstrated professional aptitude in architecture, design, or project management. The announcement was brief and functional, written in the same language that all company communications used. I read it in the break room on a Tuesday evening between calls. I read it twice. My supervisor put the application form in my locker the next day with a post-it note that said, "Only you should." I filled out the application that night at the small table in my flat, using the portfolio section to submit photographs of the sketchbook drawings I had been making for years. Community centers, public reading rooms, a covered transit shelter for a neighborhood I had driven through dozens of times where people waited in the rain. I submitted it before I could reconsider it, which was the only way I knew how to do something that mattered to me. I was accepted into the program 6 weeks later. It was a Thursday afternoon, 7 months after the gala, when Beatrice Langford walked into the drafting room on the 22nd floor and set 2 cups of coffee on the edge of the table where I was working. I had a desk there now, a real one, with my name on the room assignment board by the door. I was still getting used to the way the light fell in from the west-facing windows in the late afternoon. I was still getting used to a lot of things. I looked up when she sat down the coffee. Beatrice was looking at the drawing spread open on my desk. It was a community center, a real project now, not just a sketchbook entry. A neighborhood organization in South London had come to Langford and Beaumont through the new initiative, looking for a firm willing to take on a pro bono design consultation, and I had been assigned to the preliminary work. The plans were early, rough in places, but the bones of it were there. A main hall with high windows, a reading alcove along the north wall, an outdoor space designed for summer programming. Buildings for people who would never attend a rooftop gala. Beatrice looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she picked up her coffee and said, "The north wall overhang might cause shadow issues in winter. You'll want to check the solar angle." I looked at the drawing. She was right. "I'll run the numbers," I said. She nodded and turned to go. Then she stopped, her back still to me, and said, "It's a good building, Mr. Whitaker." I did not say thank you because it had not been a compliment in the conventional sense. It was an assessment. And in this building, from this woman, those were different things. After she left, I sat with my coffee and looked at the drawing and thought about the night on the rooftop. Not the confrontation, not the crowd, not Sebastian walking away with nothing left to say. I thought about the 4 minutes before all of that. The corner of the terrace, the sound from the party carrying over in waves, a woman whose hands were shaking, and a choice that was so small it should not have mattered, and the strange way that small choices accumulate into something that changes the shape of everything after. I had not saved her that night. I knew that clearly. She had saved herself the way people always ultimately do, by deciding what they were willing to let be seen. All I had done was offer a hand when she needed one, stay in the room, and say something true when it was my turn. It turned out that was enough. More often than people expected, that was exactly enough. I picked up my pencil and went back to the drawing. And outside the west-facing windows, London kept going, indifferent, illuminated, and entirely unaware that somewhere on the 22nd floor, a man was designing something that might actually matter to the people who used it. That was all I had ever wanted. Looking back on everything that unfolded on the rooftop of Langford and Beaumont in Canary Wharf, the lesson that stays with me is one I never expected to learn, yet it has reshaped how I see life itself. In that quiet corner, with the London lights stretching out like distant stars, I realized that true strength is not in never breaking, but in allowing someone to stand beside you when you do. Beatrice did not need grand words or heroic rescue. She simply needed a hand extended without demand, a steady presence that whispered, "You are not alone." I had seen her pain through a ceiling panel months earlier, the kind of raw vulnerability we all hide behind polished facades, and in offering that dance, nothing more than slow steps and silence, I learned that the smallest acts of genuine kindness can pierce the armor we build around our hearts. It taught me that vulnerability is not weakness, it is the quiet courage that invites real connection, that truth spoken plainly can dismantle years of pretense, and that one moment of staying when others turn away can spark profound change for everyone involved. We all carry unseen burdens, pretending the weight is nothing, but the right person, in the right instant, reminds us it is okay to lean. That night showed me life's most precious gift, the power of simply being there, and how such ordinary choices accumulate into extraordinary transformation. If this story has stirred something in your own heart, tell me in the comments below, what small act of kindness ever changed your world? And if you long for more tales like this, full of quiet hope and hard-won truth, do subscribe to the channel and join our growing family here in London. Your support keeps these stories alive.